Hey everybody, my name's Alex and this is Bento Radio. Now before we get started, I just wanted to say if you really like the show, be sure to subscribe to it wherever you get it, whether that be on YouTube if you're watching it or in your favorite podcast app of choice. And if you are watching on YouTube, be sure to scroll down and hit the subscribe button, and right down there maybe just hit the like and notification bell, so the video gets more play in the world, and so you can know when there are new episodes, which, if you're wondering when that is, the episodes drop every Thursday around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's East Coast time, so definitely go do all the things and hit all the buttons. And if you can leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, and you want to leave a 5-star review, that would be really helpful. But so the other thing I wanted to start putting out there is I will be going back to Anime YC again this year as press, so I will hopefully have a bunch of stuff around that once we're a little closer to the show. Should right about a month away right now. So if you see me in my red bag walking around the show floor, come say hi. And on that note, let's jump into what we're talking about this week, and that's a little show from 2010 called Otome Youkai Zakuro. So I'm going to throw it over to I for a plot synopsis. Take it away, I.
Otome Youkai Zakuro is a supernatural romance set in an alternate version of Japan's Meiji-era, where rapid westernization is changing society. Humans and yokai, spirits, have long coexisted, but growing Western influence and skepticism toward traditional beliefs have created increasing tension between the two groups. To prevent conflict, the government establishes the Ministry of Spirit Affairs, pairing human military officers with half-yokai girls to investigate supernatural incidents and improve relations between both worlds.
With the plot synopsis out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about where this show, which it's possible you haven't heard of, sits in the timeline of anime popularity. So, and if you've been listening to watching the show for a long time, you've probably heard me talk about this already, but I think it bears repeating here. From the late 90s to the early 2010s was a really specifically oversaturated period of anime releases. We were getting things that were, while great, maybe had no business coming out. And the thing was, everything had its own fan base, everything was popular, but it was an era of things like attachment licensing, which if you ever wondered about what attachment licensing is, that was when a company a Japanese licensor would say something like, you want this show, then you also need to license this show at this cost, because we know we can't get it licensed on its own, but attached to a thing people want, then we'll be able to get it licensed and it'll be a further profit center. Well, financial nonsense. But what that means is that the entire thing was fairly unstable and fairly unsustainable in the way that it was, and you'll hear older otaku like me talk about when the bubble bursts, when the anime bubble burst. And that essentially means that the bottom fell out of the anime industry and the licensing of it all, and everything slowed down and everything kind of reoriented and definitely changed. And a lot of that was due to piracy, and a lot of that was due to what they called gray market anime watching at the time, which was just straight up piracy. People weren't using the streaming sites we think of when you think of streaming anime. And not only that, but the main streaming site that you think of when you think of streaming anime, especially in North America, Crunchyroll, started as a pirate website that essentially collated all the different most popular subtitling people out there. Some of those subbing groups are still around, but they're not as... Watching a fan sub is very different watching a quote-unquote fan sub is very different now than it was when anime was at its peak in the early aughts to the early 2010, in like the late 90s to early 2010s. And that, like, all those tools are still there, but like, goals have gotten easier to make, if that makes any sense. The reason why I'm saying all this is because in addition to getting stuff we maybe shouldn't have gotten, we also got stuff that would seem odd now. We haven't, like, conversations like we've been having lately, in that because anime got so popular and the licensing got so crazy and everything was getting licensed, for a while we were getting tons of things that you wouldn't otherwise get or see, because especially once Crunchyroll went legitimate and streaming started to pick up, they needed programming. And between the bubble and that, you started to see stuff that was so much, that went to such different places than the most popular versions of that thing. So you saw stuff that was very that was still very related to something like Dragon Ball Z, but a very different style of shonen action. Saw things in the case of this were very much rooted in historical fiction and in the kind of magical girl tradition, but not quite in the same way as something like Sailor Moon. And you also had, because anime during this period had the very specific and gags that are inherent to the medium, and it still does, but those have been, let's say, tempered a lot. They're not always as strong as they once were. For example, a show, there's two twin characters who get paired up with another character. That two twin characters were kind of trope, and like that was floating through anime as a medium at the time, and to such a degree that been watching I've been going on a journey of watching the entirety of Avatar: The Last Airbender, everything. I've scheduled it out, so I will be done with watching all of Avatar, reading the comics, and Korra, and the movie for a third time in the doing that as well. That, in the very first season of Avatar, there's an episode called The Fortune Teller. It's a throwaway episode. But in that episode, they have twin characters. And that's definitely an homage to kind of characters you would see in anime around the same time. And twin characters in question are Banbori and Hozuki in the show. But that feels like twin characters that you see in Ouran High School Host Club, or the twins you see in Special A. It was like an ensemble casting, if that makes any sense. But what's really interesting about Otome Youkai Zakuro is that it's set in a very specific time period that if you're not paying attention, it's fairly easy to miss, but it's also set as a kind of version of what like a magical girl shoujo thing could look like. Because very often when people think of magical girl, probably the most common thing you think of is Sailor Moon and that type of thing. You might also go to Madoka Magica if you want the magical girl. But there was full spectrum of what magical girls could look like and how you could treat them. And combining this with kind of era post-Japanese Russo War of Japan heavily modernizing, but resisting it to a degree, is really interesting, because there's a scene really early on where they're all sitting and like eat breakfast, and like all the soldiers and the yokai women have been like up relatively recently, and they're all sitting at the breakfast table, and in comes the food, and they're given milk. And you and I, growing up in America, think of milk as just like a part of a balanced breakfast. But kind of them have very... soldiers and yokai women included have varying reactions to it. Zakuro, notably, is just like, oh, gross, this is gross, I hate this. Literally says to her, like, I'm supposed to... They drink it out all the time in the West. And, like, this is a pretty... So this is interesting, because this works in two kind of... In anime, in, like, context, that's, like a historical thing they're referencing of, like, around this time was when you started serving milk with breakfast, and, like, you started getting more Western, like, sensibilities and, like, things. And not specifically not American necessarily, not yet, but like, you know, on the breakfast plate kind of thing. But it's still certainly there and like very different mix than we're. And so the whole show has this slightly monster of the week vibe, with an underlying mystery of why stuff is happening. But it also centers around the changing of the calendar from a specific calendar to what you'd think of as a Western calendar. And messes with that affects the world of spirits in a way that they're dealing with for a large portion of the show. And the thing I always find interesting with shows that deal with yokai and shows that explicitly are about coexisting and problem solving when it comes to the yokai world is that these shows they have to get into it, and they have to be about what the almost mechanicalness of the almost mechanics and world building associated with yokai. So in the very first episode, they encounter, I think they literally call this thing Raiju, and it's a thunder spirit. And Zakuro and the other girl have to almost tame it because it's gone, for lack of a better word, it's gone feral. And it shows up, and when it shows up, they're all like, oh, hey, it's Raiju, like, this is fine. He's harmless. He looks scary, but he's nice. And then he tried to kill Kay. And he tried to kill the two little pumpkin twins. Though I think the show actually does a pretty good job of it. There are your three more traditional human, quote-unquote, looking yokai. Actually, 5, because Bonbori and Hozuki are twins. But they are they're the mascot characters of the show, and also they're the way the show gives the viewer to immediately relate to yokai characters. But then, one of the things that I think is really excellent about the show is that it doesn't handhold you any harder than that. Oh, we gave you 5 normal-looking, can make body pillows out of them all day long, female characters. For the rest of them, we're just gonna go ham. There's Zakuro's animal companion is a weird jackrabbit thing, and then there are these 2 child characters who are just weird little pumpkin-headed nightmare children. One of the directors of the Spirit Association is just an elephant man. The girl's caretaker is a dog woman of some sort. And then there are attendants who are just straight up tanuki, who are just like tanuki women in Pride Maiden clothes. And hilariously enough, the first time you see them, they're trying to kill a cockroach, and their solution to do this, because they are freaked out, is to turn into the big tanuki statues and bounce around the room. So Kay, who is fully afraid of spirits, he is petrified of them, is trying to find the bathroom because, once again, this is the period of time when just after the Japanese-Russo War, and he's like, it's outhouse times, is what I'm saying. So he has to go to the outhouse in the middle of the night, and he stumbles upon this room with just giant tanuki statues bouncing around. He's like, oh god. But my point there is that so many of these shows can give you varying levels of ways out of the mysticalness of it. They can give you a way to... They can make the 5,000-year-old demon into a little anime girl and let you be okay with that. And I don't think this is a bad thing. So for a perfect example of that is in Mushoku Tensei. Roxy is canonically just 40. She is just 40 years old, and it's understood that she will outlive most of the cast. And she's okay with that. And, at that point, her and Rudius have a conversation about, at some point, you're going to be 90, and I'm still going to look like I'm 20. We need to make people understand that I'm going to be the one who carries the family traditions forward. It's fairly touching. But they don't... At no point does Rudius ever romance, if you're an anime-only watcher, at no point does Rudius ever romance something that looks non-human. In the way that you have characters who are full and meaningful characters who are just a bipedal elephant. I always like that because it asks the viewer to think outside of themselves in a really key way. And the other thing about the show is that the characters like Zakuro, Bonbori, and Hozuki, and I forget the middle girl's name, the other one who's not a twin, but they are all, the show says this pretty quickly, they're all half-yokai, which means that they're half-yokai, and which means that they all have box ears, but they all present largely as human and function largely as human. But they are all 5 of the girls kind of sit in between place in terms of what they represent, which is also really interesting, which is especially interesting in a culture which by that time very much had the idea of what they call a hafu, which is a specific term and slang for people half Japanese. Think Naomi Osaka. And if you ever wonder where this comes up, this was like an aspirational thing for a period of time because, especially as a woman in Japan, if you were half Japanese, that meant people thought you were a model because people thought you were taller than normal. And it was a common thing for if somebody was not even as tall as what you consider tall here. If someone was as tall as I am, people would be like, oh, are you half Japanese? Or do you work in the modeling industry? All this stuff. Notably, I think that in Paradise Kiss, I think that George Koizumi was 6 feet tall, but I think that Yukari was it's supposed to be my height. Which I always found was interesting and weird, because they're oftentimes depicted as being the same height in that thing. But in any regard, the angle of Sakura and the other girls being half human plays into the show down the road. But it's an interesting way to show biracial characters and but also be able to sidestep a potential for unintended racism in the story, unintended racism that mimics a feeling of the too close to real in the story. Lots of times in stories dealing with race that are put out by largely homogenous cultures, you can get these things that are like, oh, I know you're trying to do this, but you're also hitting points that are really in the right vein, but you're not addressing them in the way that you're addressing the stuff that you're talking about. And that leaves the viewer, especially an American viewer, feeling really odd because you're like, I know you want to have a conversation about race, I know you want to have a conversation about all that stuff, but you have to know the stereotypes and the things you're pulling on, and when you do pull those threads, you have to address them, and by not catching one or two, you can't, it almost like you lose privileges for the entire set. Also the just really weird, not weird, and not even unexpected, but anime has a racism problem sometimes. Case in point, Mr. Popo. But that's not to say that it's not just like black people, it's also Korean, Chinese, anyone who isn't pure blood Japanese catches strays all the time in anime. Very often, still to this day on some level, although it's gotten way better. Mr. Popo used to seem par for the course for a period of time. He is not anymore, thank God. But using mixed race characters where they're half Japanese, half yokai, or half human, half yokai, lets you have that conversation and have those conversations without necessarily stepping on all the landmines, but still being able to have a conversation essentially about biracial relationships in a really meaningful and interesting way. Because you have to be really careful when you're talking about and I've learned this firsthand by doing it well and by doing it not so well. You have to be really careful when you're asking a viewer to engage in a controversial topic, because you need to make it feel like it's not, you need to make it feel like you're not, the viewer knows you're absolutely not going to cross a proverbial line there, or give the viewer enough cues that they know that when you cross that line, it'll be okay. Like, you won't betray their trust and bring them to a place that's so overwhelming that it either traumatizes them or reactivates old trauma or things like that. And if you ignore that stuff, that's on you, but if you ignore that stuff and your viewer doesn't meet you where you're at, you can't be surprised. And a good way to handle that otherwise is to find a fantastical version of what you want to talk about that's so removed that the viewer can see what's happening and somebody with enough media literacy can understand it, but it doesn't touch the hot stove, so it doesn't touch the third rail, so to speak. And I think the show, in its treatment of the biracial character, and in its treatment of the biracial characters being intentionally selected to be paired with normal human officers, in what you're fairly sure by even in the beginning of the show, intentional idea of we're going to pair these half-yokai, half-human women with these human officers as like explicit experimentation of furthering of relations and of romantic relations between the two sides of a potential conflict, so it feels so like for the betterment of the future, so to speak. It feels pretty explicit, once again, even by the first couple episodes. And that allows the viewer to come along for the show on its own terms, and it doesn't feel as dicey as if it was, oh, all these girls are biracial in a way that is much closer to what you're feeling now. Because you can certainly tell meaningful and super interesting stories about that, but there's this stuff you're going to encounter there where you have to look at it and be like, maybe we don't have a watermelon-obsessed biracial, half-black, half-Japanese character. That's not a great look on any level. But by doing it with yokai trappings and traditions and settings, you get to play with a very mystical idea that, yes, these girls are very human presenting, but they're not humans. They're capable of doing things that humans aren't capable of. Pulling a cherry blossom branch out of a little jackrabbit thing and turning it into a knife and using it to pacify a giant monster. But once again, the human presentingness of them lets both the viewer and the in-world character drop their guard enough. And also the thing that lots of D&D style racial allegories don't handle well, and that is dark elves and high elves are still too close to like black and white to feel like safe ground to tread, if that makes any sense. You still have characters who are melanated darker and characters who are melanated lighter, and you're still applying storytelling tropes to each side of that's still dealing in racism in a real way. Usually when you're dealing with things like yokai or fairies, you're straight up saying, oh, you're having the yokai characters be prejudiced towards the human character because they perceive the human character as just not knowing enough about the world. Any good show worth its salt that deals with this kind of stuff is like, oh, there's such a human way of thinking about things. The milk idea that I brought up in the beginning actually serves as this. Zakuro is like, she's like, what the heck would humans want to drink cow milk? What the hell? And they laugh it off with it being this cultural thing that's happening currently in that time period of Japan. But the thing that the yokai girls really represent is a much older, more spiritual, less modern version culture of thing in the opposite direction, which actually takes place around the same time period, when I stop and think about it, is Golden Kamuy and a Sherpa in Golden Kamuy. She called herself a modern Ainu girl. And it's like, the show treats her like that, but when we think of a modern character who considers himself to be a modern character, we think of that being about technology in a lot of ways, and the degree to which somebody uses technology. But what it really is it's a kind of headspace and a kind of treating of an acceptance of a certain set of cultural shifts that you identify as modern. So, a perfect example. By the time I was in college, pot was not yet legal. I don't even think in Washington, or I don't think it wasn't legal in any of the states. But it was that period of time where just before stuff like that becomes legal, where like everybody, tons of people are using pot. The people who don't use pot don't care about whether you use it or not. It's very much seen as being, it's seen for what it is. You encounter it and and yes, people are still certainly being arrested for pot possession and stuff, but it's well on its way to being normalized, which is the first step to being legalized. And then eventually, as you're aware if you live in the United States, it gains momentum and is legal in a lot of states. Legal where I am on the East Coast. But my point is that when I was in college, I went to art school, so like doing worse drugs than pot. But pot was also everywhere. But there was a girl in, I think it was my first year, because I was still in the first year apartments, who I met, who she was convinced that she saw Reefer Madness and she thought that was a PSA. She actively sought those things about pot and people who did pot. And in that way, she was really out of step with the world around her. And like, even people who really knew her, oh, don't worry about her, she just don't bring it up. And that's probably the real way to think about people who are modern. And I know this in people in real life who are too quote-unquote modern feel trend-chasey, or even worse, feel tech bro-y. In that there's a real possibility that the stuff they're chasing is too much. And the great thing about this show is that all the girls feel like they're adapting to what will become the modern world, but they still clearly have deep and meaningful and important connection to what came before. And all the soldier characters feel like people who grew up in a world that they're leaving behind them as they go through time. They're at a much earlier point on that path than you're used to. So characters like Zakuro, characters like the five girls, are seen as being modern in the way that a Sherpa is seen as being modern in Golden Kamuy. They're seen as being the first yokai to step into a much more modern society. And so when you see characters like Raiju, who shows up in the first episode, what does that look like for that character to move forward with the rest of the world, to continue to exist in a world that eventually has not just like Model Ts, but like skyscrapers? And there's some really excellent shows about this. I forget the name of it, but there's a show from a couple seasons ago. There's two shows from a couple seasons ago that are essentially about yokai living and dealing with the modern world. Because the thing that's really excellent about Otome Youkai Zakuro, this show, is that you get three shows in one. You get historical fiction, you get historical fantasy, actually, you get romance, and then you get an industrial age story, and actually we'll tack on an adventure story at the end there. And that's it. And like I said at the beginning, you don't get shows like this as often anymore, because the fandom has really coalesced around different tentpoles. Think the amount of isekai we get now, the amount of shonen jump adaptations we get now. There's not, and one of the great things about now is we're getting back to more experimentation. You're seeing more adaptations of things which had Atelier, of Freyren, where we're getting more room again for things that are not these like giant tentpole once again, isekai or shonen, which are the two big tentpoles of the moment. We're getting slowly more shoujo stuff again. For a very long time, there was a real drought of shoujo in anime because people couldn't see the potential for it to be as popular when the Fujoshi fan base was also being served by things like Jujutsu Kaisen. And if you've ever wondered, well, why is it important to also feed a Fujoshi fan base alongside a female fan base alongside the male fan base? If you've ever wondered, part of the reason why Gundam is so popular is because from minute one, Gundam has had rabid, very devoted female fan base that writes fan fiction and very invested in the extreme homoeroticism between the male characters for Gundam. It's well known that Char Aznavour has a deep and unrequited crush on Amuro Ray and always will. And I've always found this show haunting and endearing and really interesting. So on that note, that's where I'm going to leave it. So,
hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.